Today we like to welcome everyone back to Stein Fireside Chats. I'm Kai Miller.
Brian Clausen.
And today we have two visitors who are joining us together. We have Professor Tim Dennison from Oxford and Professor Greg Worrell from here at Mayo Clinic. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about what Stein is. We are here at the world headquarters of Stein. It's a society for technology, engineering, and innovation in neurosurgery, although now the N at the end is going to probably stand for neurology and neuroscience as well. And what it started as was a way to hang out and talk about technical details related to neurosurgery at national meetings and things like that. When I was a third-year resident, we started it, and I would show up with these custom-made steins related to the meeting that we had. This is one from the recent Boston meeting, one for each of you guys. And it would allow us to talk about little technical tricks and tips. And after coming to Mayo Clinic, we've sustained it. The most recent ones are now starting to be organized by residents and medical students and scientists that we work with. And so we thought we would have this as a way to interview people who come in from out of town, like you have, and also some people from Mayo, and then also to talk about the technical tips and tricks we pick up related to intraoperative electrophysiology, neuromodulation, and neurosurgery. So that's what it is. I don't know if you guys would like to just jump right into questions, and we can start asking you guys a little bit about what you do independently and then kind of what your interaction has been over the years.
The first thing that comes to mind would just be, Stein in cubed. You can still have neurosurgery first, then there could be neurology and neural engineering. I like that.
Well, if we did things appropriately, it would be neural engineering and neuroscience first, because that's where things come from, and then neurology, because I don't know if we should say this on camera, but I'm pretty useless without a neurologist to figure out who's the best person to get surgery and then to take care of the patients in terms of optimizing their devices over the long haul. So neurosurgeons are, I think we have an important role on a given day to make sure that the best job happens, but I don't know that we're certainly not the most central role in all of this. Brian and I, I think we sort of try to do all of those things together. He's originally a computer scientist. I don't know if you knew that. So we do the electrophysiology and research together.
Any ham radios in the OR?
Yeah, would love to do that in the OR. Yeah, for sure.
See,
And drones.
Drones might be useful. Pass me a scalpel.
They have neurosurgery articles about everything because people need to have articles to get residency spots and so forth. Drones in the OR might be the next thing.
Actually, that helps me understand things. It's good to know about the requirement for papers. That explains some of my observations the last 25 years.
They even have, there's a recent neurosurgery article about neurosurgical arms race score. Oh. So it's an article about arms race articles for these people who have to apply and get in. And I think if it went to more towards encouraging papers for people who read rather than papers for people who count, it would be helpful.
You want to lead off?
Yeah, what would you like to know? I'll tell you a little bit about myself. And so I've been here since 1996, moved here for a short 4 years. That became 25 years, going on 30 years, and worked in epilepsy that whole time. And early on, as we were taking care of patients, we'd do these highly invasive diagnostic procedures called ECOG, where in partnership with neurosurgery, electrodes would be deployed on the brain. And in some cases, maybe as many as in those days, probably 40% of the cases, they wouldn't have a resective option. So they would have gone through this 10-day procedure with electrodes implanted in the brain, only to find that, this isn't going to work out. We don't have any therapeutic options for you. So at that time, it was really revolutionary when NeuroPace came in. The Sante trial for anterior nucleus of the thalamus was going on, but really got hung up in the US for reasons that Tim knows a lot about. But so NeuroPace, that changed the game for us because we now had an option, a therapeutic option for people where we knew where their seizures were generated, but that it couldn't be resected. That was right at the beginning of my tenure here, and got actively involved in that early safety feasibility trial and then the PMA trial, and started learning about devices. So that was exciting, and really through that, and then anterior nucleus of the thalamus stimulation for epilepsy, met Tim, who was at Medtronic, and long period of collaboration
Yeah,
after that.
it's probably going on 20 years,
Yeah.
15 at least. Maybe I'll start also how we got into the space.
Sure, yeah.
So, like Greg, I started as a physicist, didn't go quite as far, but what
Big
got me
question for physicists maybe is which rite of passage is which color was the Jackson edition that you had?
mine was orangish
Yeah.
red.
Mine was orange as red.
Yeah, I had that for a year, and then we switched over when I did an undergrad, and then when I
Did
did
the
it in
problems get
graduate
a lot
school.
easier in the blue version? 'Cause
Yeah.
it was like divine inspiration to solve some of those
They
problems.
did not. Nor did it get easier for me. It went from short and fat to tall and still
Yeah.
fat.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry.
Oh no, that's fine. So, but when I was an undergraduate in Chicago, and I remember I was in like second year, and I said, I raised my hand. When do we get to the modern stuff? I mean, it was probably we were going through, just getting into some quantum. And I remember the professor said, "What do you mean how modern?" I said, "Like the stuff you're working on." I said, "Well, you do that as a graduate student," and I'd do an elective, and they had these kind of canned biology classes you could take, but they weren't as satisfying. So I actually asked if I could do a cellular neurobiology class out of curiosity. And I remember the first lecture, John Art, he went through and then he ended and said, "And that's all we know." And every class he would take us right to the edge of say, "And that's what we know." And his class, we'd have labs. And so we had to build our own current clamp, patch clamp, earthworm experiments, cockroach sensory, and it just really turned me on to neuroscience. And so that set the bug when I was a second year. And then as a grad student, switched in electrical engineering and controls, because I've always I was very applied all my life. And well, yeah, got to know Greg. Started out in cardiac pacemakers at Medtronic, but then I designed airbag accelerometers. And so when you talk to Cameron, maybe, design him an airbag for his car. But then, so I've always liked safety systems and high risk. There was a lot of quality considerations for that. And then I just wanted to get back into kind of neuroscience and medicine, medical electronics. At that time, Medtronic was just starting to think about sensors. So, NeuroPace was setting the stage with RNS. They wanted to get started with an accelerometer and a spinal cord stimulator. And because of my past, they asked me to come over to neuro. And then when I was in neuro, I said, since I've been doing amplifier chips also with people who are in the community may know Scott Stanislavski, Wes Santa, Tom Adamski, kind of over the next 10 years, actually pulled over a lot of my friends from the cardiac space and then did a lot of fun work together. And they're still doing it. So that's when we met, starting to get the next generation devices ready and research tools for epilepsy. And a bit for Parkinson's.
Sure.
Yeah.
So
It's interesting that it was the accelerometer though that got you.
yeah, it was the accelerometer that was the original. And the great irony is that it's still not woken up on devices. And I always
It
said,
is on the RC plus S.
When you say
it's on the research tools, but in the
when
commercial
you say
products,
woken up, that means that these are on board. On some of
it's
these.
on board. It's basically dormant. It always was ironic for me because it's movement disorders. So I thought the first, and even sometimes even the FDA actually would ask me, it's like, it's movement disorders and you've got an accelerometer.
You might want to.
Tim, do you think your team can connect the dots? And so I felt like offering them an internship and then they could come help. But
That's an interesting connection as well to cardiology. When NeuroPace came in the field, they were all cardiology people largely. I mean, there were epileptologists advising, and I was on that early advisory board for NeuroPace, so that had epileptology. But really, the engineers largely were from the
Yeah.
cardiac space, and the idea that we now look back on, but was that you're going to detect seizures, and then you're going to stimulate to abort seizures.
So defibrillation, yeah, like cardiac
Yeah,
defibrillator.
right out of the cardiac playbook. So I think
Not quite that simple.
it didn't actually work out like that. We implanted those initial patients, Rick Marsh at Mayo Clinic here, some of the earliest patients implanted, and remarkable. People outliving their lives, capturing spontaneously occurring seizures, download it to the computer. Well, at that time they didn't have that cloud interface, but you could get that data when they came into the office and see the onset of the seizure, beautiful detections, stimulate, and as long as it stayed in episode, detector still activated, stim, and you have all these examples of doesn't do much to the seizure. Once that seizure started, the stimulating is very hard to stop seizures. So my first foray into fiddling with detectors, which was very interesting, they had 3 features that you could tune to get with the idea, well, if we can just get earlier in the seizure. So you tune, you make the detector more sensitive. Of course, you get many more false positives. And really the evolution of that early trial was, once you get up, you get your best results once you get up to 800, 1,000 detections a day, therapies a day. And that was an early conversation you and I had in San Diego. I was at the podium, you were in the audience. Being a smartass.
I was keeping you honest. Yeah, you showed the beautiful one, which
I had an example.
he had a what do they say, a best perfect
I had
normal
a
example.
unicorn.
Yeah.
Seizure, patient outliving their life, seizure detected, stimulated, aborted the seizure. That's kind of like, pigs fly. How many do you got to see, Dennis?
I was also going to say, and statistically, that might have just been on its own truncation. But oh well, But I mean, actually, especially for your audience, there's lessons to be learned, even from what we learned in neuromodulation. If we could do background stimulation and prevent your heart from ever going to fibrillation, we'd do it. So I think that's the one thing. It's like even that model, it's what the technology has today. But if we had the signal. And people are thinking about that, like stellate ganglion stim, things like that, to use neuromodulation to try to calm the heart. So, it's been a fun journey. Well, it's not over. It continues on.
Did you guys ever look at vagal nerve stimulation for arrhythmias?
Oh, I wasn't part of anything on that, but
Basically using the vagal nerve stimulation, which obviously we use for epilepsy, but to try to influence the heart.
Yeah.
I mean, we implant it on the left side to try to avoid cardiac side effects, but.
Yeah, I do a lot with Alex Green at Oxford now, and I think he has a real passion for autonomic neuromodulation, and he's interested in the stellate DRG. It's also one of those, like we were saying earlier at the conference, just you observe one space, look for the crumbs like that. And when he was doing DRG stim for spinal cord, DRG spinal cord stim, but for chronic pain, but if he got the electrode in the right kind of T level, he'd also see blood pressure get modulated. So he's like, well, maybe there's something to follow up on that. So yeah, neurocardiology, place to watch. It's like plastics, so it's
young man.
Young man, the future is neurocardiology.
Yeah, The Graduate. I wonder how common people are used to quoting The Graduate.
Yeah, exactly. Go watch The Graduate if you're under the age of 40.
So something I'd like to hear about is obviously you developed a few devices. At the conference we were just at, you talked about several different devices that you built over time, and maybe we can get back to asking you about some of the new ones later. But when you developed the original sensing devices for Medtronic, first the PC plus S and then the RC plus S, the device that we have in the clinic that Brian and I implant in patients for movement disorders, and obviously we implant for some patients with epilepsy as well. The functionality of that is not the same as the functionality that Dr. Worrell, that Greg, has going in our patients who are RC plus S patients. Can you tell us something about the discrepancy between potential capabilities of systems when they're built? Are they over-engineered to start out with the anticipation of, well, I mean, come on, it's an interview. Are they over-engineered to start out so that the capability that many of us want is sitting there and then can subsequently be unlocked?
Yeah.
And what do you think that, where should there be sets of progressive guardrails so you engineer a device and that the software demands in the future for getting cloud compatibility and all these things are going to evolve, and the ecosystems are going to evolve, but developing a device is you want to anticipate everything you can want in the future, because my understanding is that it's better to have some things that are superfluous, than to have features that you really want and will be essential for care, but they're not sitting there. And is there a path to roll stuff out by unlocking in the future?
Yeah. So first, it's a big team. So there's a whole bunch of people responsible for all of the research tools, and even in the research tools, those built on devices that were and basically regulated and released. Like the Activa PC was our first one. So so it's kudos to that entire team. Like, I think at least 50 people at any given time might be working on it and supporting it one way or the other. So one of the challenges, actually going back to that NeuroPace point, was that Don Dio, who was our vice president at that time, he said, we don't really know what the biomarkers will be. We don't know what the algorithm should be. And so let's not...
What are we going to sense?
It would be, well, yeah, and it'd be premature to say this is the product. And so the other issue in devices is they're very, very expensive. And so what we try to do is find a balance of upgrading, if you will, the Activa PC with a sensing toolkit. It's kind of, we call it the science payload. So some sensors, custom ASIC for, and this is published, so it's out there, custom ASIC for measuring the brain rhythms, the accelerometer, microprocessor for running the algorithms, and a memory for storing data. And it really was bolted on to the top of the Activa PC. And the FDA was a really good partner for that. They liked the partitioning, so it's actually as clinicians, it was a nice clean partition of this is the therapy side, and then the science toolkit wouldn't mess with it, and you could shut it down. So for all intents and purposes, when you weren't doing your research, it was a standard DBS device. So that's the spirit of like the extra capability with is actually part of that's just driven by the unknown. So you want to actually have the capability to learn, test new things out. And what's nice about electronics, after the millennium is we can flash, just like your smartphone, we can flash upgrades for the algorithms and the functionality. So if anything, the hard part is to try to look into the crystal ball. This is why you got to talk both to the neurologists, the neurosurgeons, but also the neuroscientists, and say, what is it that we think we need, looking 5 to 10 years in the future or beyond, to try to put in that hardware, and then it can be basically upgraded over time. But now, like I was saying, a lot of the team that is working with Scott Stanislavski, Wes Santa, Tom Adamski, Eric Pankin, some people in the audience might recognize. They were all in it from the beginning, but we all grew up together in cardiac pacemakers, and by design, cardiac pacemakers actually have a lot of forward-looking capability. And then the marketing team actually plans like firmware upgrades on this, year to 2 year cycle. So we grew up as engineers in that ecosystem, and we just kind of brought it over to the neurospace. And there it was considered novel at the time, but it's really how a lot of devices are constructed. And then the big win for us was right when we finished the Activa PC Plus S and some of the support tools, they kicked off the Brain Initiative, and that was just like putting a turbocharger on the research program, because it just gave a conduit. Got the FDA, the NIH, DARPA, everyone got on board. And both Medtronic, but then also Abbott, Boston Scientific, everyone was putting in their next generation device for people to evaluate. NeuroPace, they were supporting a lot of researchers, and so also that Brain Initiative was an amazing catalyst.
So I got kind of a, let's say, a contentious question to ask, and I think
No way.
So I think I asked somebody who's with actually Medtronic, and still at a conference where it was aired as well, I think. The federal government, and you've seen it on both sides now, because you've been in engineering academia, you've been sort of an industry leader, and then now you're an academic leader at Oxford, as well as being basically you founded companies. Hopefully we can get into that in a bit. But with all of that investment of the federal government in these new devices and all the investment of the time of scientists that they spent, all of the people who participated in the studies, what do the companies owe in terms of releasing capabilities on these devices? You know, I mean, like, should we be able to access the and forgive me if I'm using the wrong technology, but should we be able to access the ASICs for these? What capabilities how much do they owe to release? And should we, if companies haven't acted in good faith in that over time, should there be penalties?
Yeah, we've got to be cautious. So I think one thing is I did the back of the envelope actually in San Diego. Yeah. You remember that? They were talking about jobs in neuroengineering, and they talked about academics and government. And I did a quick back of the envelope, and I think the taxes that Medtronic paid basically would cover the entire NIH neuroscience budget. Yeah. And so I think that's one of the things is each of the companies pays significant taxes, and it goes into support research. So in my model, I look at it as a kind of a cycle loop where the government puts in for research and academics who actually make the discoveries and write the patents, creating intellectual property from government grants. Yeah. So I can be contentious back. The U.S. taxpayer is paying their grants, and they get paid out of that. So I think, but what it is, there's no ideal system. I think it's a good system. So the academics can make the discoveries, then that gets a commercial partner to see it through. If it's commercially successful, they pay taxes on it, help out the patient, and then that tax goes back in and helps to fund the next generation of research. So, and a lot of times the reasons that and I'll come back to your earlier point on the capabilities, a lot of times when they don't release things, it's because it's not ready for prime time. And I really wanted to commercialize the original PC+S, and Don said, let's keep it as a research tool, helping the Brain Initiative. And as soon as we got out there and started to support people, I went back to him and said, thank you. You saved me from myself. It just wasn't ready yet for a commercial embodiment. We still had a lot of learning. So, because a lot of people would look at signals, scratch their heads, and what you realize is it wouldn't be a clinical benefit. And that's a key thing. There's a difference between a research benefit and a clinical benefit. And so on the clinical side, it would have been a massive burden. It would have been confusing. We might have actually had people make the wrong decisions based on the data because we were dealing with artifacts and things at the time that we didn't fully understand. And so that's even what you see on the commercial launches, is that there's this amazing scope, but it gets actually scoped down so it's ready for a broad scale clinical deployment. This is my quasi-contentious back. You live in the Mayo Clinic ecosystem, which is kind of a storied spot. Yeah. You're not representing the broad community of the community neurologist and some of the others who are doing the care. And so I think finding that balance is a bit of a tricky calculus, and that's where I'm empathetic to the choices they made.
Yeah, I would say, you mentioned that the Brain Initiative kicked off, and our initial discussions, I think we had one of those in that first round, calling you up and saying, and Matt Stead was a big part of this. If we can get Denison to provide the API, so we'll have that bidirectional interface. Yeah, we'll be stuck programming in C# on a tablet. Yeah. At that time, there was a Microsoft phone that had C#. So I remember the picture of that grant.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, it's a person, implanted electrodes, data.
Bill let us down.
Yeah, data streaming off the device onto the phone, up to the cloud. We were going to change the world. The first thing that happened is Microsoft, they no longer make those phones. So we didn't have a phone, we had a tablet. Yeah, that's still pretty good. But having that API, of course, was just a transformational empowerment for us as investigators. And then I think, like you're saying, that, you know, on the positive side of that, what we saw that came out of those 10 patients with those couple of programs with the RC+S and people with epilepsy, yeah, we can continuously track seizures at home. We can change therapy when they're at home. We can stage brain state, you know, build algorithms, do similar to NeuroPace kinds of stimulation in the hippocampus, which we knew already worked. We had ANT, since it's a 4-lead device, we had ANT stimulation. So we really leveraged that new device on already proven therapies for the patient. So
The science payload.
Yeah, but
the science payload then, you know, provided this enormous data, which has had for us has had a lot of impact.
but I'd like to be able to take, you know, it's still helping those patients that we implanted, right?
Yep.
And I'd like to be able to help new patients using the toolkit that you invested time and built that's helping our patients with those experimental devices, with features we would hope to be able to unlock on, you know, the commercially available device that's out there now.
And that can still be a part of the research. So it doesn't have to cloud the complexity of clinical care for people just using the device for clinical care. But there is a continuum of how difficult it's going to be for the researchers to unlock that, I think. And I think that could become a little smoother of a process.
To your point, actually, I found the API interesting from a culture change.
Yeah.
So Greg's an example, but he's also an example of an outlier. He has a PhD in physics, and as well as being a neurologist. And so Jeff Herron, you know, I put out names because some people I will miss, but, you know, Jeff Herron, Dwayne Bourget, Ben Isaacson, and Terry Ahrens, they actually stepped in on the summit and provided that API infrastructure, and then Jeffrey really championed it. When it was released, the Mayo Clinic, you know, you grudgingly accepted it. So you may do, but actually when I called up the research
Could we
site,
get this in Python?
yeah. So it wasn't like, oh, thank you for the API. That was not it. So the Mayo said, okay, we'll make it work. But other site, you know, so Phil Starr, UCSF, and in particular, you know, Helen Bronte Stewart at Stanford, they said, you know, what am I supposed to do with this API? And because one of the challenges was now, while it gave flexibility to the researchers, it also transferred a lot of the burden in terms of the software. And in the case of Mayo, because of the risk profile,
The regulatory
you
part
actually
of
had
it.
to do the 62304, and you were even Class C. So the highest software requirement for the FDA. And so the way that the researchers responded was actually to come together. And I can still remember sitting at my desk, and I think Phil Starr, either you shared like your IDE with Phil and code, and he shared his IDE with someone else, which was just absolutely unheard of. I mean, this, you know, and the group kind of said, let's collaborate on the tool and then compete on the science. And that became kind of the ethos, and then the Open Mind Consortium and everything kicked off. But for me, it was an unintended consequence of transferring this big burden of research over to the research community, actually brought them together in this new ecosystem that didn't exist until then. And so it was an odd unintended consequence, but yet kind of cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's tough to get it just right. And no matter what the decision is, some people are going to be unhappy and some will be satisfied. But I can see, I'm empathetic for the people who, you know, ultimately do make some of the commercial decisions, because it is a business that they're trying to run, and they have to bring in the revenue. And even after the PC+S investment, the Summit RC+S investment, it was time. They actually have to get back that investment and start to bring it in, and frankly show that there's actually a business behind the sensing, the algorithm, not just research. You know, it's not, these companies, many companies don't exist as research tool providers. They're actually trying to create a therapy. And so you do have to kind of ease into the therapy and learn.
Sort of interesting. and I think we would love to, do more sensing on the movement end. In epilepsy, as you alluded to, having a closed loop aspect to your hardware may be completely irrelevant. The sensing has a lot of value long term in being able to understand patient seizures, even when they may not be able to accurately report them because they're amnestic or they're asleep, or it doesn't raise it doesn't raise enough symptoms for them to notice it. But that's still extremely valuable in how you care for our patients, independent of the stimulation. And so the difference between sensing and stimulation, and then having a closed loop where one feeds off the other, how much sophistication in that closed loop process should sit on devices versus streaming in and out. And I mean, if it's a fast Bluetooth device, then you could keep a lot of the closed loop algorithms off of the device itself, right?
Yeah, but then you can talk about the burden. Everything's a trade-off.
Yeah.
So.
So that continuous streaming, so those patients that we have out there, and we've talked about this a number of times. We took the RC+S wasn't designed for the study we wanted to do,
But we scrambled.
but
and
we
adapted.
scrambled and made it work. But we continuously stream the data off in that program, and so the patients had to charge once a day, even sometimes twice a day, and so there's a lot of extra patient burden.
And keeping that peripheral, so you got to not just the device charge,
Right,
but
you
also
got
the peripheral.
That's another thing I remember. Oh, this is the system. You've got the implant, you've got the telemetry antenna, you have the tablet, and then later, we added some wearable just to make it even more complicated.
For people who have amnesia. So, yes.
But yeah, there's a lot of stuff to keep charge on, and I think that obviously will get better in ideas like smart sensing. Do you need to stream all of the data? If you have more memory on the device, you can imagine clever ways of, capturing all the seizures. I guess just jumping back, at least for epilepsy, just a fundamental core gap that remains is the seizure diary, actually having an accurate seizure diary. And that doesn't sound so complicated, but a lot of engineering that has to happen to make that possible.
It's interesting in a lot of these spaces that we look at. There's a book, actually. Your birthday's coming up, so don't go buy it. It's called
35th birthday.
but it's beyond
35th, right?
Yeah, your 30th try until you get it right. So but beyond measure, and it's actually about the importance of measurement and the way we do science, and think about seizures, but also chronic pain, disorders of consciousness. And you kind of think about some of these, depression, all these areas that we talk about for next generation devices, and getting an objective measurement is like a common theme across all of these areas. And I think that's like, for those youngsters, plastics, neurocardiology, and objective physical
Signals.
markers and signal processing are areas to think about.
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, I think about devices in terms of potential biomarkers we would look at, right? If you're doing stimulation evoked potentials, your device signal to noise is sort of okay, right? You can get by with something that the RC+S is more than capable of doing that if you could index timing and so forth. So maybe that'll be unlockable, I don't know. You tell me. But then the next thing would be capturing these oscillations, right? So the beta oscillations is a marker of Parkinson's disease. Although there may be fluctuations where you might want to look at some second spectral thing like phase amplitude coupling with the beta oscillations instead. And in order to do that, you have to be capturing very, very high frequency changes, capture these broadband correlates of sort of average neural population activity and see how those are influenced by oscillations, which requires yet another degree of subtlety and instrument fidelity, right? So you have these three tiers. And I think there's distinct steps between what you need to do those, right? I mean, the devices that are out there now are probably good at oscillations, but maybe not.
Yeah, and there's actually capable devices. A couple companies now have very capable evoked potential measurements. But the other thing, here's my little bit of a caution. So I'm the pragmatic, Minnesota engineer, just living in Oxford right now.
Oh, you're a fancy Oxford guy.
Yeah, that's the. But yeah, it's still a farmer at heart. is not also to overlook the simple stuff. And so, like we were talking about earlier today, that when we had these devices now that can sense, NeuroPace has been used to see rhythms, but we're using the timeline feature. One of my colleagues, Joram van Riede, who works in our lab, he was looking at Parkinson's patients with the Berlin group, Andrea Kuhn's team, and between 40 to 60% of the variance in the beta band is just time of day, linked to circadian sleep-wake rhythms. And so one of those, I look back, students often ask, what would you do different if you could go back? One of those things is just to
Put a clock on.
Put a clock, $1, which it's actually on the device. It's like we put a clock on. They used to have this kind of stim modes, and I'll come back to that because there's some funny anecdotes about that. But because you got to do it right, but you can do that simple. Like before we do all of this really complex stuff, can we do like half of the variance the patient's going to see just with a very simple solution? Something that a community neurologist can understand, not that, like they'll just get the technology. It's pragmatic, because where I'm empathetic, especially in the national healthcare system, it's just the time constraints of the standard clinician. They need a very efficient way to help their patients and improve their therapies, but it's got to be a pragmatic solution. So that would be a pragmatic example. And that's how a lot of cardiac pacemaker algorithms are very simple. And that's what makes them robust and scalable, and to hundreds of thousands to millions of people a year, is that they're robust and simple, and basically the community of practitioners are capable, along with some assistive tools. But the one thing even with clocks is that, as you all know, clocks can beat if they're not exactly right on. So what you do have to watch is if you set up the clock and you don't periodically reset it. As they say, the Zeitgeibers in circadian, you need your time giver, which we lock to the sun and other cues. In the absence of that, your daytime program
Becomes
going to become your nighttime program. And so you do have to be cautious, and even these simple things, patients changing time zones. So I do a lot of circadian stim with my team right now, and I can still remember when we would switch program groups. There was a slight sensation that the participant would feel, and he knew it was coming. And then we switched to British summertime, and it went an hour differently. And he called me up and said, "Hey,
where's my change?"
Yeah, he said, "Hey, I figured something out. Your device doesn't change with the time zones. It doesn't leap forward and spring back. Spring forward and leap, fall back." And so it's even in these simple ones, there are things you have to think through.
That's cool. So I think we've used a fair amount of time. I'd like to hear some about what you've done since you left Medtronic, since you left Minnesota.
So part of the things that changed, one of them is thinking more about circadian science, and that's just the ecosystem you sit in. And so there's a lot of work there. With Russell Foster at Oxford, but also really started to work a lot with Dirk-Jan Dink, who worked with...
We had that DARPA program.
Yeah, we had a DARPA program together. And what's fascinating with these devices, when we live, we think so much about our areas of epilepsy, Parkinson's, and the like. But Dirk-Jan's fundamentally a circadian scientist. And when he saw the timeline features and the streaming data coming out of the Mayo team, and Simon Little was part of the grant as well, and seeing what UCSF had coming from its RC+, he said, this will completely change the way I can do circadian science. He says his standard is you come into the clinic, you do a polysomnogram for 2 or 3 days, and that's it. And he said, so Greg's showing, here's 1 year of data, basically that I've gathered of the rhythms, and Dirk-Jan's like, he literally said, this is the future. So a lot of thinking about, from an engineer's perspective, the role of feed forward as well as feedback. And that's, I think, physiology has feed forward and feedback. And actually a good control algorithm includes both. Because if you can predict the error that's about to come your way, don't wait for it to occur to respond, get ahead of it. And so that's the principle of the research. And then we've built in partnership with a small company in Bristol. We started to build a research tool to explore these concepts. I have a playbook. You've probably figured that out. So the therapy device, like the Activa PC, was the PicoStim. And then the research payload was the Dynamo for dynamic neuromodulation, which is a name I got from my friend Hyria Channon and her program. And that's then evolved into a number of brain applications. But one thing that always bothered me was that in incontinence, there's urge incontinence, which is what sacral nerve and tibial nerve go after, but stress and mixed incontinence are big unmet needs as well. And so once we had the dynamic system, we said, hey, we can modify it based on what we've learned on what we're trying to do with epilepsy and tweak a few things and go after mixed urinary incontinence. So at Stefan de Wachter in Antwerp and Charlie Knowles at Queen Mary in London, we put together a program and then ended up getting some investment with Aidan Crawley as an entrepreneur in residence at Oxford and started up Amber Therapeutics. It was, for those younger people out there, look for opportunity. It was meant to be a side project with a little bit of funding to kind of explore this space. And now it's actually the primary driver of the platform and helping to, at the same time, enable a lot of the brain research.
And you said something earlier about when you went to Oxford, the classic academic public or parish,
Publish,
the classic academic publish or perish. That when you got there, they basically are prioritizing translation over sort of the classic metrics for academic success.
Yeah. So they like the publication, but I'm funded by the Royal Academy of Engineering in these chairs of emerging technology. And so a key part of our role was to grow the UK economics and ecosystem there. So, I think there's about 50 of us now in different areas of tech, quantum computing. I've got a colleague in Glasgow, Keith Matheson, so we collaborate quite a bit. He works on prosthetics, and so, kind of a nice adjacency. And he does a lot with retinal implants, and like Science Corp has some of his tech. And, we're trying to, our metric of success is not just seeing what our, publication impact factor, it's really also how many jobs we're creating, the revenue we're creating, and ultimately, are we getting therapies on the NHS? It used to be all publications, and now it's very much a mix of publications, the educational environment you're providing, and your impact. And that is things like, are you getting products out the door that are helping society?
And so does that take you off of the grant treadmill?
No, you still got to fund all that work. So somebody's got to pay for the work. So yeah, sorry. That maybe means a little. I'll spend a little more time helping startups. So giving them advice and some coaching than say writing a paper. So like when it'll come down to, okay, I don't need to write another paper right now. I really need to help these 2 or 3 startups figure out how they're going to secure their seed funding, and give them advice. Listen to their pitch decks and give them some guidance.
Yeah. Anything you could see? I mean, you've had a fair amount of exposure to Mayo Clinic, state of Minnesota. About these grants that the state of Minnesota has. For us, we all do research in clinical medicine together. How can we be more like you? How can we make it so that?
Well, he's doing that. He's got Cadence Neuroscience. And,
I was going to say, Tim's been really instrumental, all the way back, the things we learned along RC+S. A lot of those learnings came forward into Cadence, and then of course you've been remained involved in your relationship with Kent and all the quality management system that came through OpenMind. That was
actually Kent drove a lot of that too.
Yeah, God knows I didn't know any of that. I still don't know it very well, but yeah. So it's really a small little ecosystem there, and we appreciate all the help. And there's probably more to do in the future.
Yeah, I think the way I see it, everybody has a role. So my favorite expression when I call up, it's like we got to get a band together.
Yeah.
And I actually use that word very intentionally because it's like you can't have 4 lead guitars. I'd actually say that's a problem in academics. It's like a lot of people want to be the lead singer, and so when I say band, I'm actually being very intentional of trying to build up a group to fill a bunch of different slots. And I think that's, actually when I interviewed for my job, I said, I'm not going to be on the cover of Nature all the time. And I said, you already hired that guy. His name's George Maliaris, and he works at Cambridge. Because George is, fellow of the Royal Society now, and I said I'm not that kind of academic. I'm much more of a translational person, but I'm actually very comfortable with that. So I'm comfortable with my role in the group, and that's the way I put it to Peter Brown at Oxford. Sometimes that means I'm playing the tambourine, and but I actually explained this to him
That's
once.
a visual.
No, but I mean, I actually told him once, because I actually said, the difference that I see in a lot of because we were actually debating whether you're the senior author or not, and so a good collaborator over years, Gregoire Courtine, so Nick Buse at Medtronic wrote some software, customized a device. Very, in the grand scheme of things, a very small change, of which Gregoire made it just do amazing things over the last years. Peter said, "Oh, but you're not the senior author, so well." And I said, "But you see, that's the difference between us, Peter." Is I said, if the Beatles, if John Lennon called me up and said, "Tim, I've got this band, and we really need a tambourine," I said, I'd be there. And I said, from a classical academic, I'll never get that image out of here. So I said, from a classical academic perspective, they're like, he's just the tambourine. And I said, but from my world I'm a Beatle.
Yeah.
And I said, that is like the way I see it. It's like, I just want to play with Beatles. It's just, I may have not a very big role, but I want to be hanging out with people like that.
I'm your tambourine player. Well, hey, it's really nice of the two of you to come here. Brian and I are grateful for you taking the time. It's beautiful to see a friendship that has produced so many useful things for so many patients. So I'm proud to be associated with the two of you.
Friendship built on many tears and frustrations, but some successes too.
I wanted to come back, Brian Claassen, he had the first IDE for the PC plus S, but
At Mayo,
at Mayo, for epilepsy and Parkinson's disease through the great Matt Stead. It's like, we'll get Brian to do that.
Yeah, we got to push through.
Yeah.
And I think kind of kickstarted a lot of things off.
To your point, Matt held us to a very high standard.
Yeah.
So he made the team a lot better. He pushed us hard.
And that data was absolutely critical for that next step for the RC plus S. We had those handful of patients. So.
And that's it. Think of it. I know you can get frustrated, but think about it like it's a infinite growth and a roadmap. So, almost everybody wants to be, 2 stops up, but we'll get there. It's just going to take time. So, all right. Yeah. Thanks for having us.
Gentlemen.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And thanks for the time.
All right. Yes.
Yeah.
It's yours to take home.